Good afternoon, everyone. Sounds quite loud from up here. Can everyone hear me okay? Too much echo? I'll stand back. We are thrilled to welcome you here. I'm Susan Abrams, CEO at Illinois Holocaust Museum and Education Center, and on behalf of our Board of Trustees and directors, our wonderful staff, and our incredible volunteers, 400 incredible volunteers, it's my pleasure to be here with you today for this special Voices of Conscience program. As you can imagine, today in our world, it's as important as ever to be talking about our voices and to be, in fact, for every single one of us, a voice of conscience, speaking out for what's right and to make our world a better place. And so we can think of no better speaker today and program than to welcome Elisha Wiesel. His father was here with us when we opened Illinois Holocaust Museum and Education Center in our beautiful Skokie headquarters in 2009. And who better to be in conversation than J.B. Pritzker, who also has been with us all the way at Illinois Holocaust Museum and Education Center. And J.B., as you'll hear a little bit more about, and again, as most of us in this room know, is carrying on the legacy of his parents, for whom today's lecture series is named, Donald and Sue Pritzker, who worked also tirelessly to enhance and improve our community and our world. Quick question, how many of you in this audience have been to our museum? That's most of you. How many of you have been there yet to see our survivor holograms? And that's just a handful of you. So I just want to say, for those of you who aren't members, you received a coupon for an admission to the museum in gratitude for your coming today and all that you do in our community. And we are so proud at this pivotal moment as our survivors are aging to be leading the way globally in our world with how will we tell these absolutely critically important stories for future generations, for our grandchildren and their grandchildren. And so this is something we're very proud of. We look forward to welcoming all of you to see it at our museum. But now I'm going to welcome JB to the podium and we'll get our program started. So one more thank you for being here.
Well, good afternoon. Oh no, I want a response. One more time, good afternoon. Good afternoon. Terrific. My wife, MK, and I created the Voices of Conscience lecture series to honor the memory of my parents, Sue and Don Pritzker, whose legacy of human decency and integrity continues in the promotion of civil and human rights. The purpose of the series is to educate the public and serve as a catalyst for intergroup dialogue about the Holocaust, about genocide, and about human rights issues. Elisha Wiesel is most appropriate as a presenter for this series. His efforts to carry on his father's amazing story and legacy and to combat hatred are needed now more than ever. This legacy resonates with me. I am not the son of a Holocaust survivor, but it has been my privilege to be treated like a son or like a grandson by all of the survivors involved in the creation of the Illinois Holocaust Museum and Education Center. What they have dreamed and what they have accomplished is frankly nothing short of remarkable. Elisha Wiesel is the only child of Nobel laureate Elie Wiesel of blessed memory and Marion Wiesel. He grew up in Manhattan and suburban New Jersey, but also accompanied his parents on many international travels. As a teenager, he was a fan of heavy metal bands and envisioned a career programming video games. Elisha earned a bachelor's in computer science from Yale University in 1994, and then spent a few months doing basic military training in Israel. He soon joined Goldman Sachs as a strategist. By the way, studying military training in Israel is probably a great introduction to military service. Military service is a great introduction to Goldman Sachs, isn't that right? So he soon joined Goldman Sachs as a strategist in the commodities business. He was named managing director in 2002 and a partner in 2004. Today, he is the firm's chief information officer, overseeing the technology division with joint responsibility for the firm's global strategy. Elisha is here today with his wife, Lynn, and their children, Elijah and Shira. And Elisha, I want to say how fortunate we feel to have you among us and to bring you on stage. Ladies and gentlemen, Elisha Wiesel. We'll do it without, oh, can you hear me? We need to turn it down a little bit. Some parent needs to give a better AV production facility for how they work.
I can project. Oh, there you are.
There you are. Okay, you can hear me and you can hear Elisha.
Testing, testing.
Okay, very good. This was our test. All right, now officially, Elisha Wiesel.
Lovely to meet you.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much, and I want to say what an honor it is to meet you and to tell you that I had the honor. In fact, the other day I was in the attic of my house looking at old pictures, and from 2009, when we opened the Illinois Holocaust Museum and Education Center, I found pictures that I have with my whole family, with my children who were then very young, with your father and your mother. And it brought back great memories, and he really helped us usher in a new era here in Illinois for Holocaust education, and you know, I was honored to get to meet him. So I just, meeting you is to me a revisiting of that really great memory.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here with the rest of you in this community.
Thank you. Well, I want to begin by trying to hearken back to your earliest memories of your father. Maybe you can just share, because I think we all know him in a certain way as an author, as a humanitarian, as someone I think we all look up to, but he was your father, and yeah. So you know, you have a different perspective in the very earliest memories of your father. What was he like as a dad?
So before I sort of count backwards from 10 and go to that place and try to remember, maybe we can just, can you guys hear me, by the way? Is the mic good? Can we just maybe comment on logistics? Are we going till 2:15? I just sort of want to, is that what we're doing?
I think that's okay. Right. I think we're on for about 1 hour.
Okay, good. Mm-hmm. So look, you know, my father was not quite prepared to be a father, and I'll explain what I mean on a number of fronts. First of all, you have to remember he lost his parents at a relatively early age, so he only had memories of parenting until that point at which he was separated from his parents, his mother having died obviously on arrival to Auschwitz, and his father dying, you know, later, you know, en route to Buchenwald. So he didn't have a memory or a pattern for what it meant to be a father through teenage years. And, you know, nor was he someone who had grown up in America. So the concept of being, you know, the father of a teenager in America was challenging for him, I think, on a number of fronts. You also have to remember, this is someone who really for you know, many years after the Shoah had felt very strongly that it was a mistake to bring Jewish children into the world because of what the world had done to Jewish children. So I think there were many, many adjustments going on for my father. From at a very young age, my father was incredibly loving. He would sing me songs. He was always telling me stories at night. He made up, and he was a great storyteller, so I can still remember the stories he would tell me, at bedtime. They would be departures on Kabbalistic themes, masked as children's animal characters, really fantastic stuff. But I will tell you that it was definitely challenging for him when I became a teenager. I don't think he quite appreciated what the burden was going to be on me as a young person growing up with his legacy at that age. And I think when he appreciated it and sympathized and empathized with it, I think he didn't necessarily know how to connect and how to make that burden easier for some time. So, there were all sorts of things I had to teach him. He threw, as some of you may know, the first pitch out at one of the 1986 World Series games between the Mets and the Red Sox. I had to teach him how to throw the baseball. Which was, there are all sorts of little great stories like that about what that, rich relationship was like.
So he didn't know much about heavy metal bands, you're saying?
No, he believe me, and I tried to play him. There's one Metallica song called Creeping Death, which is actually the story of Passover. And believe it or not, he let me at one of the Seder's bust it out. Can I say he was impressed or moved? Not greatly, no.
Well, and do you remember the very first time that he told you about his own life story?
Believe it or not, there's no one memory that I can point to where my dad sat me down and said, this is the story of what happened. I have very vivid memories of him doing that every year with regards to the exodus from Egypt. We would sit down at the Seder table, and he would read the words, Avadim Hayinu, L'faro b'Mitzrayim. That concept of a story that he told with regularity to me as his child is very firmly imprinted. But for me, it was much more of an ambient learning experience in terms of my father's experiences. Other kids were going to Long Island for their summers. I was going off to Poland to visit, the death camps at ages 8, 9, and 10. And it wasn't so much of a let's sit down and talk about history. It was much more of a absorb all these things and realize that my father had gone through these things and that he had a role to play in the years to come in telling the story. But we really didn't talk about it much at home. I think it was one thing for him to open up to the world on this topic, but for him it may have been almost too painful to open up on it with me.
And did you, at some point in your life, I'm sure because you were just absorbing it, it's, you're taking it in, but probably not philosophizing about it, right? So at some point in your life, you probably, I don't know when, tell me, in your teenage years or maybe in college, you maybe had a moment where you realized the truly amazing, the gravity of what had happened to him and the impact that your father was having on the world, or did that just sort of wash over you?
Look, life is funny that way. It's going to sound incredible to all of you, but this is how I perceived it. You have to remember, certainly as a young person, age 8, 9, or 10, what do kids do when they talk about their father's work? They kind of use it to brag. And I remember I had friends, and one of them would be saying, "Oh, my father is a pharmacist. He makes the medicines to help people." And another friend would be saying, "My father was a fighter in the Israeli Air Force. He helped Israel be victorious." And then for me, I'd be saying, "Well, my father was a victim." And you have to understand how that sounds or feels as a person at a very young age. It was very hard for me to see my father as a hero because everybody was telling me that his claim to fame was as having been one of the world's most famous victims. And that doesn't necessarily translate well into the world of egos on the schoolyard, in first or second grade. So I think it took me a relatively long time, even when my father won the Nobel, already as a young teenager. I remember how going to a religious Jewish school, here was yet another reason now why everybody was going to look at me in the shadow of my father. All of these expectations, little ability to define my own identity, and actually, I will say a little bit of teenage resentment, if anything, about that. Really, for me, I think there was a turning point during my Israeli, military training. I happened to be there for Yom HaShoah, and, we had a little ceremony. And, at that point, I was developing an ever greater appreciation of the state of Israel and how precious a thing it was, and also how precious a thing the concept of a Jewish identity was, and a Jewish identity that survived a Holocaust. And when my commanding officer at the time spoke, he spoke in Hebrew. And at that point, I could understand it already. He said, "Meod kashe liot Yehudi ba'am hazeh, aval, b'zmanim hazeh, aval ani meod gaeh." And he said, it's very difficult to be a Jew, especially in light of all of these things that have happened. But he said, "But I am very proud." And that, for me, I remember that being a moment where I started to really put all of history together. And I was already 21 years old, so relatively late, I think, for me to develop this concept of how this all flowed from, over the last 70, 80 years until today.
And so you have your own children.
I do.
And what are their ages?
12 and 9.
Okay.
9 going on 16, though, I should point out.
So just as you were talking about being 8, 9, and 10 and just sort of experiencing it, have you taken a different approach to this? How have you presented to your own children, who their grandfather was and what it means to the world?
Look, you'd have to ask them, and maybe someone later on when we do the open Q&A will ask them, but I would think that they remember their grandfather primarily for what he was in their life, which was a loving grandfather, very involved in their lives. The apples of his eye, couldn't have been prouder. And I think that, in terms of Holocaust education, we've done some of that. On Kristallnacht, some years, we'll get a YouTube video to try to do basic education. In the days after my father passed, my son, of his own initiative, picked up Night and wanted to read it and understand a little bit more. I had intentionally, I think, tried to spare them from a lot of what my father's history had meant, simply because I think they deserve the same chance that my parents tried to give to me, which was to grow up without that burden lingering over them. This concept of history that can be weighty as well as liberating. So we've done some of that, but I would say that there's an element where we're very invested. And this is a very important theme that I think a lot about when it comes to remembering the Holocaust, which is we can remember the Holocaust as a world event and what it meant that humankind got to the place where these things could happen, and how committed we all have to be as a people of the world to make sure that this never happens again. But the Holocaust was also a story about an attack on Judaism and the attempt to end a people. As my father has said, not all victims were Jews, but all Jews were victims. This was an attack on a certain faith, on a certain people. And if you think about the odds that are stacked up against us throughout history, even now, and I can talk about that a little bit later, there are many forces conspiring to end the identity of the Jewish people as a people. So where I'd say we're very, very invested in the home is in Jewish education, whether that's learning Hebrew, whether that's observing as many elements of Shabbat, as we choose to do, whether that's getting to shul, not just on Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur. I'd say that, when my son was born and we had a bris, it was a real turning point for me in terms of my connection to Judaism. And, we've raised them as best we can with Jewish values and a focus that Jewish education isn't just something we do, once a year in the fall. Jewish education is a continual part of how we're raising them.
You make me think about my own circumstance of trying to pass along to my children the enormous importance of what it is to be Jewish, and in a way, a burden is placed upon them to carry on a tradition that I pointed out to my children recently that today in the world there are roughly 13.5 million people that identify themselves as Jewish.
It's not a lot.
And roughly the same number of people identified themselves as Jewish right after the Holocaust.
Yeah.
So if you think about the population of the earth growing and the population of Jews staying roughly the same, the burden of carrying that tradition on seems pretty big, but it also is a big responsibility, and I've tried to make that an important positive for them. I only pointed out because I think what you're doing, particularly because your father was who he was, that there's a special responsibility, not a burden, but a real responsibility that they get to carry on the tradition, and particularly his tradition, the way you are.
There are two major responsibilities that I think my father felt very keenly, and I feel my father was a great man, not just as a world individual. He was a great man as a private family man. But I think in terms of his stances publicly, there are two major responsibilities he urged people to take. One was to be universalist, to learn the lessons of the Holocaust, to make sure that We incorporated morality and ethics in what we do on a global basis, that we're all citizens of this planet and we need to treat each other with respect. And that to doing so can actually feel good, to connect with people, that yes, it's a burden, but it's also incredibly liberating to engage with that part of one's soul. But my father also felt very keenly this responsibility of perpetuating the Jewish people, the particular. And for him, there was no paradox. If you were to ask him, well, what's more important, is it the particular or the universal? He would say yes. They're both incredibly important. And he believed that by being a good Jew, he was a better citizen of the world. There was no conflict, no contradiction. And in terms of this responsibility to be a good Jew and perpetuate Jewish faith, I think he felt very much that that was an enjoyable thing to do once one had immersed oneself. That the teachings of the great Hasidic rabbis, the stories from the Torah, the Talmud, that these were things that could enrich one's life. They weren't a burden, but once embraced, they were things that could liberate you. I want to tell you a very brief story about a close friend of mine from work at Goldman. When I met him in 1994, he was one of the first people that interviewed me and I later worked for. He told me this story. He's of Hispanic descent. His parents came from Mexico, ultimately to New Mexico. And he was telling me how he remembered as a child, his grandmother, and he could never figure out why, would light candles on Friday night. Grew up Catholic. And they had a silver candelabra on their table with 7 arms. And these were just curiosities. They didn't really know what it meant. And later, much later, after he'd done some research, and I think he'd read my father's work, or it had been given to him, The Jew from Saragossa, I think he realized that he came from the Marrano line, Jews who had escaped the Inquisition in Spain by going undercover, by adopting the Christian faith publicly, but retaining the Jewish faith privately. And now all that was left of some great tradition from 500 years ago was candles being lit on Friday night, a silver candelabra. Now, I'll say in this particular case, there was a lot more that remained strong, a passionate commitment to education, unbelievable family raising, but these were what was left visibly from his Jewish upbringing. And you think about today, and you think about the Jewish people and the statistic that you quoted, and look, in some parts of the world, they are trying to kill us. When you hear people talk about how the state of Israel has no right to exist, make no mistake, these people want us gone. And we're also being faced by intermarriage and assimilation. And you think of all the family members you know or friends you know where the choice is being made to set aside the Jewish faith, to just assimilate into modern culture. How many generations out until all that might be left might be candles being lit on a Friday night without even knowing why? And then how many generations until that's gone too?
You know, when we worked on and built the Illinois Holocaust Museum and Education Center, it was a committee of Holocaust survivors who had sort of adopted a few others of us, Howard Zweibel and others that are in the audience here today. And the principle by which the survivors, operated to build the museum was, we are telling our own story and we are conveying the universal lessons of the Holocaust. And it's precisely what you just said. It's that mix of, I'm a Jew, I want my story told, but I also know that in that process we are conveying something that's much more universal, even than the preservation of Judaism. So I guess I want to ask you a question about your father's and your views of the genocides that have occurred since. By the way, the survivors involved in the Illinois Holocaust Museum were very much involved in expanding the law here in Illinois. We were the first state in the United States to pass a law requiring, in 1990, teaching the Holocaust in our schools. There are now, I think, 28 states or so that have a law like that. But over, I think, 10 years ago, that law was expanded to, now it's called the Holocaust and Genocide Education Act, and to include the genocides that have occurred since. Your father was known to have been outspoken about genocide more broadly, and had significant views about that he made known, and I'm sure you do too. Can you share with us your recollections of the way he reacted to the other genocides in the world and his activities around that?
Listen, my father had sleepless nights when he saw what was happening in Rwanda, in Bosnia, Darfur, these places. It really plagued him, the thought that had nothing been learned. And what were we going to do differently? Were the major allies of the world going to intervene or not? And he took every opportunity. I remember at the invocation when the U.S. Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. was built, my father did not miss a beat to talk about genocides that were happening now and address President Clinton at the time, saying, you have to do something. When he had been invited to the White House to receive an award, same thing. He was, very, very much on point. And for all the nice things that were being said about him for 12, 15 minutes, he would say, he would be gracious, he would be thoughtful, but he would go straight to the point within 30 seconds on what are we doing today? Where is the responsibility for American leadership? And why are our leaders not consistently following through on it? So he was greatly troubled by it. He went to Bosnia, he wore that UN helmet. He was active as best he could throughout to shine light on it. And it didn't matter if you were, Muslim or Hindu or Tutsi. It didn't matter what the nationality was or the ethnicity was. And I tell you, when you look at the environment today where, there are still too many nations in, Western Europe that have not opened doors to Syrian Muslim refugees, he would have had a problem with this if he were still here to see it and speak about it today. And, as someone who's close to what he thought and felt and his biological successor, I tell you, my family and I, we feel that too, and we're outraged by it as well.
Well, I know your father's words had great impact on President Clinton, because to this day, President Clinton says that his greatest regret in office was that he did not intervene faster in the Rwandan genocide.
Yep.
And I know it was your father who spoke to him about that.
Yep.
So maybe it'd be helpful to get some insight into, did your father, over the years that you knew him, maybe more as an adult, did his views about looking back on the Holocaust change, do you think? Or are you aware that during his lifetime, his views as he looked back on it changed, either more informed or just evolved in some way?
Look, I think there were learnings that he had along the way, and when he had new information, I think he reacted to it. He couldn't have known this for the first decade or two of his life because he didn't have access to the information. It wasn't public, but I know that when he learned that the US and England, that there had been information on what was going on at Auschwitz, and that bombs were not dropped on Auschwitz because the decision had been made to protect all military resources, for more direct military intervention priorities. I think he was very angry about that. And much as he respected Roosevelt and Churchill and had many great things to say about those leaders, I also heard him publicly rail against those leaders and the decisions they made. He would talk about how, they prayed for bombs to drop on Auschwitz, less for the damage it would have caused, less because it would have stopped the death factories, although yes, of course, that too, but more for the signal that it would have sent to the victims that they were not alone, that their plight, once understood, was deserving of a signal so that they could know they were not alone.
Mm-hmm. So do you think that when you think of the impact that your father's views have had over the years on so many people on not just the Jewish community, but really the world, what do you think is the biggest contribution, that if you had to really focus on one thing that your father has made, his contribution to society, what do you think that greatest contribution might be, or among the one or two?
Look, I think my father made contributions on a number of levels. On a broad level, the audience that he reached, the audiences he reached with Night, the audiences he reached with his very public stances against injustice, whether it's Rwanda, Darfur, Bosnia, or even standing up to President Reagan over Holocaust memory and what it meant for a US president to go to the Bitburg funeral. I think he put it in the consciousness of the world that it is appropriate to stand up for memory and for justice.
Right.
And I think that was a very broad and critical contribution. But my father also made contributions that I think we won't know the value of in our lifetimes. And what do I mean by that? My father made contributions as a teacher. And not everybody was lucky to have him as a teacher. But since he passed, I've met more and more of his students. And I have to tell you, when you understand the contribution and the impact that my father had in the classroom, at Boston University, at Eckerd College, all the different places that he taught, and you hear how he changed the thinking and the life paths of some of these students, this is one of those things where I think it's an investment that we won't know in this generation. But I believe strongly that several generations out, the thoughts and the actions that he kindled with his students and that they kindled in response to him will be felt, in many different ways throughout the world. We just can't see it now.
I think we're going to go at some point to audience questions, so I want everybody to be thinking about a question that you might want to ask. So, but I'll get to you in just another question or two from me, and then we'll go back to the audience. We honor our Holocaust survivors today, but during the course of your father's lifetime, it wasn't always the case that survivors were really, the virtues of and the difficulties and the challenges were all called out, and people were thought of as kind of heroes just for surviving. But the fact of their lives and telling their stories is to be honored. But your father probably saw during the course of his life a real change. Right? There was a time when even the state of Israel was, didn't want to talk about it.
Yeah.
And so maybe you can share a little bit about how did your father feel that Holocaust survivors should be honored or thought of, and maybe the change that he saw over the course of his lifetime in the way that their virtues are extolled.
You have Maslow's hierarchy or pyramid of needs. So I think before we even get to respect and higher order functions, maybe we should talk about some of the problems we have more at the bottom of that pyramid. And the statistics are pretty shocking in terms of how many Holocaust survivors, both, for example, in New York City, even in Israel and other places, although less in Israel, are living almost at the poverty level. So you have to realize there are people who went through what they went through, in the 1940s, and still they're old. They don't necessarily, get the best to eat. They don't necessarily live in places that are safe. They don't have great access to medical care. So even before we get to the issues of respect around their story, I think that there's a lot of awareness that we have to spread, that there are Holocaust victims who are, living in really not so great conditions. And there are some wonderful organizations who are, banding together to do something about it. In my hometown of New York City, there was some legislation passed only a year ago. They were very thoughtful. They named the legislation after my father, which was very meaningful to me, to do what they could to raise the standard of living for Holocaust victims. There are other more nationwide efforts through UJA and otherwise. But I would just say, we have to remember that it's not a foregone conclusion that all of these people are living well now. They're old and some of them are sick and in need of our help. When it comes to telling the story, look, my father didn't feel that he could tell others they had to tell their story. I think he felt that what was important was that Holocaust victims were treated with respect, the respect to handle their own story and what they wanted to do with it as appropriate, as they saw fit. And, the concept that at first Israel was rejecting of Holocaust victims and the class and what they represented and what they thought of the Yiddish Jews, look, that was an issue my father did not approve of and would not have approved of. I think the idea was to show respect to these people who had come through what they'd come through.
Maybe you can share with us, before we go to the audience here, that you've as the son of someone who is truly one of the great humanitarians and authors and someone that I think all of us look up to. That's got to be an enormous burden for you to carry personally. It's an amazing legacy that you have, but also it's got to be, something. I mean, it's nearly impossible to imagine for all of us to have a parent who's a world figure, whose life was about peace and whose life was about humanity. So, I mean, what is that like? What has that been like? I mean, you are an adult now. You told us what it was like as a child. What has that been like, and how are you, in his absence, how do you feel about that legacy and what your obligations are?
I think there came a switching point from childhood to adulthood where it went from being a burden, which it was earlier on, to being a privilege. And now I feel really only great pride when I think of my father. I feel that I'm very fortunate to have been his son. And there are many decisions to make. I'm very fortunate also that my parents didn't push me very hard that I had to do what they were doing, that I had to run a foundation, that I had to work in the nonprofit space, that I had to be a humanitarian myself. I had my own interests, and they created the space for me to pursue them, which was a tremendously powerful gift for my mother and father to have given me. And I think from that point of freedom, to be able to reapproach it, as I have begun doing in the time since my father has passed, I think it's given me the space and perspective to really appreciate it properly. And I don't know where the years ahead will take us. I can't, I can't predict that, but I feel a sense of responsibility, and it's an empowering responsibility, and it feels good, because to feel that I can do something for my father in his name is a great gift that I can help return to my father.
Terrific. Well, I think we should open it up to audience questions. So, yeah. You're going to bring them up. Okay. Thank you.
Oh, we're bringing them up written, okay.
Yeah, they are written.
And if people write out their questions, it would also be nice to know who's writing it and, what your name is.
Or do you want me to read it?
I think I can get it. All right. Decoding. My father was a crypto analyst, so I should be able to
Oh, really?
say.
Military?
Yes, in the Navy. I feel that the world, this is a question from
What is your
this
name?
lady right here.
Great, thank you for the question, Judy.
I feel that the world is different with our survivors no longer here. How do we as children of survivors pass on their experience? Can it have the same message?
Look, nothing will be the same without that generation gone. And by the way, it's not just the generation of survivors. I think very much about the generation of liberators, too. I think about this incredible generation that fought in World War II, that went overseas, that shed blood, that shed friends and family members to liberate the camps and liberate Europe. What an amazing generation in general, not just the survivors, and what stories they have, the liberators as well, the veterans of our armed forces. And I think about how it's to us now to tell their story. My father had a teaching, which is when you hear the story of a witness, you become a witness yourself. And I think if there's one thing we've learned from Judaism, it's that the power of memory in our tradition is incredibly powerful and can last thousands of years. Think about it. Every year on Pesach, we sit together around the Seder table and we tell a story that begins, Avadim hayinu lefar b'Mitzrayim. We are still telling the story of our national slavery. How similarly can we not be telling thousands of years from now the story of how we were almost wiped out and exterminated as a people? I have more confidence than I do concern that we will still be telling the story and learning from its lessons, because I know it is such a part of our national and religious identity as a people.
Oh my goodness. Okay. Thank you for these. I wanted to just point out to everybody before I get to these questions that so much of the Illinois Holocaust Museum and Education Center operates on the efforts of the second generation, the third generation, the survivors' children and grandchildren. They are very much a part of the programming and very much a part of the work that gets done at the museum. So I know that there are some here in the audience, and I want to
And I should recognize that I realize it's not a burden I shared growing up as the child of a survivor. I've met many children of survivors, and I know that it wasn't easy for many of us to have that history lingering in the background. Some of us had parents who wanted to talk about it, and that could have been challenging. And we also had many parents who, pretended it didn't happen and wanted to keep it away. And I think that those were challenging experiences as well. So really, kol hakavod, much credit to those in the second generation who devote themselves to keeping the story alive.
Indeed, like you. I did want to call upon this gentleman just so you can see that this gentleman was a bunk mate of your father's at Buchenwald.
Wow. I tell you, you should be up here, not me. Sorry, I think he wants to say something.
Oh, yes, sir.
Would you like to come up? Please, come up and join us. We have an extra chair, I'm sure. Come.
Take my chair.
Elisha, what is your name? Nice to meet you. Please join us. Let's see if we maybe backstage could bring out another chair for us, if that's possible.
We will. Please sit. I'm only the moderator, so I can step aside.
My name is Bonnie Wiesel. I'm a Holocaust survivor.
Oh, hang on.
Wait, I got you. Here you go.
Oh,
Speak right into that. He's putting it on. All right, we're attached. All right. Speak into it to make sure it's still working.
hello?
There we go.
Can you hear me? My name is Bonnie Wiesel. I'm a Holocaust survivor. I was 12 years old when I was liberated in Buchenwald. My grandchildren recently graduated, and I asked them what they would like for a graduation gift. And they requested that I take them to all the camps that I was in Poland and in Buchenwald. So I took them on a trip, and we finally went to Buchenwald. And my daughter on the internet found a phone number from Buchenwald, and she made arrangements with someone to guide us around and give us a tour. When we got to Buchenwald, I don't have to tell you, the Germans are very effective. She brought out a fire, told me the bag number, told me my number on my shirt, and she says, "You bunk partner, did you ever hear of a person by the Elie Wiesel? He and I shared a bunk."
Wow, amazing.
So-
do you remember him?
How could, at 12 years old, how could I remember?
Yeah.
You know. But I just wanted to tell you, it was an honor just knowing that I shared a bunk with your dad.
Thank you very much for sharing that story. If I can, no, stay with us. I think
I'll use my outdoor voice.
I think you should stay with us because maybe the audience will have questions for you as well as for
No
me.
problem.
I hope they have questions for you as well. They should. I have questions for sure.
All right, I'm going to use my outdoor voice. You can all hear me? Yes. Okay, good. So the question is okay. Sorry, the question, Elisha, is: did your father think that peace with the Palestinians would ever be possible? And even upon his passing, did he at that point think that we could get to a point where there would be peace?
My father was a very stubborn optimist, and he was asked about his views on Mideast peace very often and what it would take, and he was very clear. He felt that when the day came that the Palestinian leadership, and he didn't say the Palestinian people, because I think he believed that the Palestinian people had legitimate points and that they had every right to a peaceful and fruitful existence that the Jewish people did, but he spoke about the Palestinian leadership. And he said when the Palestinian leadership have arrived at a point that they care about protecting their people as much as they do wiping Israel off the face of the map, in that moment peace will be possible. And he always remained hopeful that that moment could come.
What more, other than telling the story of the Holocaust, having survivors tell their stories, and having museums, what more can be done to fight anti-Semitism and Holocaust denial?
Would you like to take that one?
No, I'll give you.
Sure.
I'm a guest. You're the guest.
No, listen, but you're the guest of the guest. You're
No,
an
no,
honored guest.
I'm just a sidekick.
Look, I think the concept that truth itself is under attack with Holocaust denial. Look at the world we live in now. Fake news, manipulation of the media. Is there a day where, in one form or another, truth is not under attack? And that's where I think we all have a responsibility to the truth. And whether it's a question of Holocaust denial, or really any sphere that's observed in the public realm, you know, I think it behooves us to be a sophisticated reader of the news and to be a sophisticated consumer and to think very carefully about what we repeat and don't repeat. We live in a world now where all it takes is, you know, one person to put a lie up as a tweet or mischaracterize something on Facebook, and look how it can just spread through the world like wildfire. So if I had to talk about, you know, something to take away broader than just we have to take a stand for remembering the Holocaust and fighting Holocaust denial, I actually think that it's the profession of journalism, perhaps, that right now has the most sacred responsibility to rediscover their morals and their ethics in how they think about what they choose to report or not report. If I had to think about one sphere of life where I wish we could really pump, you know, moral and ethical training into right now, I think it would be that, because we've always relied on a free press in this country, and we've always relied on an honest and accountable press for telling stories truly. And if I could wave a magic wand right now and address one sphere of how our society functions, that would be it.
It is sad that it is sad that if you walk through the Illinois Holocaust Museum exhibits, you'll be frightened if you haven't been through, and I saw many of you had already, but you'll be frightened at how many things that occurred during that period feel like they're occurring today.
Well, I hope that some of the young people at this high school end up pursuing professions in journalism and with, you know, with great thought and care, help restore it to a great profession.
So this question is from a good friend of mine who was one of the stalwarts from the very beginning of the Illinois Holocaust Museum, Aaron Elster. Your dad felt that God wasn't with him in the camp. How did he come back to religion?
Listen, it's an interesting question, because even in the camps, if you go through the writings, my father still talks about how in the middle of the night, if there was a pair of tefillin smuggled in, they would line up to actually wear tefillin in the camps. So maybe he feels abandoned by God in the camps, but he still wears tefillin in the camp. So had he left God, even if he felt God had left him? And I'll tell you, you know, nobody can speak about whatever crisis of faith my father had, because he's no longer here to speak about it. But I think that as life went on, he did more and more observance, not less. Do I think that that's because he believed in God more, or believed that God deserved it more? I actually don't know. What I do know, because he told me this, and I saw him, I saw the way he behaved as Rosh Hashanah approached, as certain key days throughout the year approached. For him, my father and his Jewishness and the observing of the traditions kept him close to his father and his father before him. So God, I say this very cautiously, But God was almost not so much part of the picture, I think. You know, God had done God had allowed what he had allowed to have, and my father argued with him and wrestled with him, believing or not. For him, observance of Jewish traditions was a way to stay connected with his past and his father, who he missed very much.
You talked about your own, managing through the legacy of your father and your own growth during that period. What about your mother? Tell us about what your observations are of her experience.
Sure. Look, my mother, and I've been asking her for some time, and I'm not alone in this, to write down her story or to do a Shoah Foundation testimony, but she's been very reluctant. She really felt that, my father's story was compelling and well known, and she preferred more privacy on it. But she had an amazing story in turn. Look, born in Austria, fleeing with the Anschluss. Her father had been briefly imprisoned, but a favor was called in. He was released by the Gestapo. They made their way to France. They were in an internment camp in Gurs for a while. They rescued my grandfather I think in Marseille, where they had to hide upstairs in a room, protected by a young Italian tailor and his wife. My mother has her own amazing stories and her own recollections, of what that was like, running and being on the run. And, my mother is an amazing person. My father could not have accomplished in terms of the breadth of his reach and of his message without my mother. My mother translated his works. My mother had an unbelievable feel for the right way to play a role on the world stage, and very much helped him in that. She was his confidant, his manager, his wife. She was everything to him, and every recognition he got, he always felt he shared with her. And especially my mother's foundation, he was very proud of, because the foundation wears my father's name, the Elie Wiesel Foundation, but the work that was done through that foundation to alter from the very beginning the life experience that black Ethiopian Jews would have coming to Israel with no knowledge of the language, the culture, modernity, that is really her work, and he couldn't have been prouder for the work that she did with Beit Zipporah, which was named after my father's sister, who perished in the Holocaust.
And will she take your advice and write down her recollections?
No, I'm her son. She doesn't listen to me. Maybe you could try calling.
Well, I encourage you to at least put a video camera on her and ask her to talk about it if she
She'd
won't.
get very upset with me if I did that, but
Right.
maybe I'll risk it one of these
All right,
days.
well then you're right. Bring me and I'll ask. We have a question from a Holocaust educator who says, I'm concerned that teaching of the Holocaust is becoming blurred with genocide and losing its Jewish component. How do we differentiate?
That's not an easy question to answer.
I'll try. If you have any comments, please feel free to jump in on this one or on any other. Look, I think, that phrase from my father, not all victims were Jews, but all Jews were victims. There have been other genocides throughout history, and Holocaust study is, I think, so important because it opens our eyes to the possible prevention of future genocides. If you go to Poland and you do the trip that this gentleman described, that Barney described having with his grandchildren. When I first went to Poland, I went not for my first time, as an adult. I went for my first time as an adult on March of the Living this past spring. And I'll tell you, we had a day or two in Krakow before we went to the camps. And when you go there, and you see the shuls, the cemeteries, and you look at the fact that there was Jewish life in Eastern Europe. And more than that, there was an incredibly vibrant and rich Jewish life in Eastern Europe. Stories and weddings and funerals and tales and people at all walks of life. You go there, and if you spend time not just at the death camps, but in the places where Jews lived, and you see how these places no longer have Jews, you realize that there was this incredible culture that was wiped out, and it was a Jewish absence that is felt. These are people who are no longer felt there, and I think that to really appreciate the Jewish elements of the Holocaust, you have to look at the life that was there before that needs to be remembered, and not just think about the killing and what happened during the Holocaust proper.
Well, this,
Very good.
I think this will be our final question, but it's a question actually for both of you.
Right.
So be prepared, whoever wants.
I'm sitting down, so don't worry about it.
We may keep you up on here on stage for much longer. So here's the question. How do you feel about the pursuit and prosecution of those who are very elderly now, but who committed crimes during the Holocaust?
From my standpoint, once you're guilty, regardless of age. Germans did not have pity on me. I was 6 years old.
Right.
I got liberated at the age of 12.
I mean, what message are we sending if there's a statute of limitations on genocide?
Well, I want to say to you, Elisha, and to both of you, really, thank you very much. And this has been so incredibly informative about not only your father's life and legacy, Elisha, but also how you are carrying it forward, how a next generation is carrying the message and the story of the Holocaust forward. And then, of course, the amazing legacy that you carry with you, which I know, as you said, a burden early in life, but you carry it, frankly, so well, and we are so honored to have you with us, you and your family.
I have to say, I want to thank you, for the incredibly warm reception, the thoughtful questions, and I have to tell you that there is sort of living Jewish life like right here, and wherever I go, since my father passed, I always look for somewhere to spend Shabbat, and there was a wonderful Chabad just steps away from here, Chabad North Shore, a vibrant, healthy Jewish community. I was very thrilled to be part of that yesterday, as I'm thrilled to be with you today. So thank you all, and really I appreciate it.
Thank you.
On behalf of
My beautiful wife right there.
On behalf of Illinois Holocaust Museum and Education Center, it's been such a privilege to bring you all this really thoughtful, moving program and conversation this afternoon. So one final thank you to Elisha, to Barney, to JB, and to our more than 20 community partners who helped to make today such a success. Thank you.
Thank you.